Good afternoon, now almost afternoon, good late morning. Welcome. There are some lunches back there. Folks can get up and get. And every once in a while, we'll get the room to turn this way for the four of you over there. I'm Karen Engel, and I teach here and I co-direct the Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice and the Sissy Farenthold Fund for Peace and Social Justice. And this is our first event of the semester. And it's also the first event that we're having as the lead up to the birthday of Sissy Farenthold, which would have been on October 2nd, 2026. So we're unfolding this Sissy at 100 project, and we have a bunch of events, and they're all on a little card that there is up there with Maya and being passed around. And you'll learn about Sissy Farenthold bit by bit over the course of the year. So I'll just say now, she was radical. She was great, and she was very involved in many, many different issues, including reproductive justice. So to that end, she would have been delighted with our program today. And I'll just say who we have here. Although, yeah, as I do that, I'll recognize a couple of other people too. So this is what you're here to hear about, is this fabulous hot off the press book from NYU Press. It's called Accessing Abortion, Global and Comparative Perspectives. And it's co-edited by Rachel Rebouché and Mindy Jane Roseman. And Professor Rebouché, some of you know, maybe you're even in her first year contracts class, or maybe know her in other ways. We're really delighted that she's here. She's involved. She's not only a professor at the law school, but she is also the faculty lead for the Sissy Farenthold, yet another project, the Reproductive Justice Defense Project. And Blake Rocap over here is the director of that. And if you're interested in knowing more, you should talk to one or both of them. And so Professor Rebouché is the Raleigh White Chair in Law. And she's also a leading scholar. Not only did she co-author, edit a contracts book, but she's most importantly, maybe a leading scholar in health law and reproductive rights in the US, as well as comparatively. She's been writing about comparative reproductive rights law for a long time. And then we have her longtime collaborator here, Mindy Jane Roseman, who is the Director of International Law Programs and Director of the Gruber Program for Global Justice and Women's Rights. I'm going to be able to say that without my notes next time, at Yale Law School. So she came from New Haven to be here with us today, which we really very much appreciate. She too is a longtime scholar and advocate and activist in areas of reproductive rights, has been very involved. If some of my students from my class yesterday are here, has been involved even before Rachel went to college. No, but since the 90s,
well, I am 35.
International governmental organizations as well as NGOs, and has I'm sure a lot of that experience will come out as we're talking today. So what we're going to do is, first of all, everybody's going to join me in welcoming. And then I'm going to sort of ask some questions to get things going. And we have till about 12:50. So we want to leave some time to let you all contribute to. If something strikes you as people are talking as something you want to respond to at some point, feel free to raise your hand and I'll try to keep an eye out for that and build it into the discussion. So, professors, exciting book. And it starts off, the introduction starts off by talking about, what was that constitutional law decision? Dobbs, that decision.
Never heard of it.
And it might be surprising to people to know that actually the Supreme Court justices thought it was important to talk about what was happening in other countries in relation to abortion. And often, I mean, it's surprising because often there's a critique of that, and we think only people do that who rule in particular ways. Um, and you all had reason to doubt what they told us because you were already working on a project, and then it sounds like it took off. So can you tell us a little bit about, I mean, I think first tell people what the court said, and then how the book responds to engages with that. And maybe I should just say, the book has amazing, so it has a great introduction by these two and an epilogue. And then it has chapters from many different parts of the world. And just to give you a sense, because some of them are actually comparative within, but Colombia, Romania, Ireland, India, Canada, the United States, which is important as a chapter in the book, the UK, South Africa, and some other sites.
So Dobbs is the decision 2022 that reversed Roe v. Wade. It's gotten some attention. And it is basically returned abortion regulation to the states, set out a pretty lengthy history of abortion regulation in the United States, which has also had a lot of commentary and then justified why Roe had to be overturned, kind of set out these 5 factors for why you overturn precedent. And in making that argument, there's a paragraph where Justice Alito, writing for the majority, lists countries that are more liberal in their regulation of abortion than the United States. And his point was that the United States was a global outlier because under Roe and Casey is the 1992 decision that upheld Roe. I think you've all taken constitutional law at this point, so we don't need a lot of detail there. But that according to Justice Alito and the majority, the United States allowed abortion on demand throughout pregnancy, and that only a handful of countries had that kind of abortion permission. Well, we have been studying international and comparative law and reproductive rights for a while, and had thought a lot about how the United States and Roe and Casey were not outliers in the world. In fact, I'd written pretty extensively about how the United States had been a mirror, anti-mirror for other countries. Why Roe was a case that lots of countries looked to and decided either to mirror or to reject a lesson learned from Roe v. Wade. So the U.S. was actually in quite the epicenter of what we describe as this arc globally toward decriminalization. And when we read the list of countries, we wrote a short piece to explain why it was misleading to, 1, call the U.S. an outlier, and 2, how the laws of those countries had been described, as well as laws in other countries. So, for instance, describing the United States as abortion on demand is misleading, pre-Dobbs, but describing countries like a country like South Africa, which has a pretty extensive piece of legislation, the Choice on Termination of Pregnancy Act, passed in 1994, that sets out kind of a trimester framework for abortion permission, but has really broad reasons for why someone can have an abortion, socioeconomic, personal, late in pregnancy. To call that a restrictive law, restricted to the first trimester of pregnancy, is just not true. And so that is what motivated us in large part to pull together chapters from across the world and to think about regional, international human rights documents and traditions. But we began thinking about that question before Dobbs, and Dobbs helped us generate a set of questions for our authors and for collaborators around what happens next. Does Dobbs become itself a mirror, anti-mirror, and how does it fit within this broader landscape of decriminalization and permission for abortion? So that's where Dobbs fits in. happy to say more about our backgrounds in international and comparative law, but
Just to add a tiny bit to that, we're located in the United States, and the Supreme Court obviously takes pride of place in thinking about, what law is and what the limits of law are in the US. Although since Dobbs, reminded us that states are also very important locations for thinking through how law enables and constrains day-to-day lives. What was interesting in taking a comparative view is just to be reminded, and the same dynamic exists in the US. The law as written is different as the law as lived. So to cite to North Korea as permitting abortion always, personally, I don't know anything about lived experience in North Korea, but it simply, to me, defies common understanding to think that you could read the law and understand anything about how it's applied. Takeaway from a comparative perspective is to really have a humility in reading the law and know that you need to consult and talk to the lawyers from the location and the scholars, as well as the people who experience it. I think I was going to make another point, but I don't remember it. So we'll just move on from there.
Well, that's a great segue, because I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you all see comparative law, including who the audience for this book is. So I think it's great that you cover a lot of countries, and then you also treat the US, or the author, like, I think it's kind of cool that she ends up talking about states, and you just alluded to that because that's another form of comparison. And often it seems like comparative law is done to say, oh, look how great something is over there, and we should just do it that way, in exactly the way you just suggested, maybe like not really knowing, just looking at what's sort of on the books. And another is to say, let's not go that way. Let's see how that's done. And maybe a third is to say, well, actually, it doesn't really look the way it necessarily seems. Seems you're kind of doing, I mean, you're dealing with a lot of different authors, and they're doing different aspects of that. So I've maybe two sub questions about that. One is, do the authors differ maybe, and are they thinking comparatively, or are they just giving you their country reports? And maybe three questions. So who's the audience for the comparison? And then finally, why didn't you give us any, like, we could say, there's some cautionary tales in the book, but there aren't any like countries that have strong prohibitions on abortion.
So maybe to start with the last question, since it's in my working memory. It is true, the selection of countries, for example, like we didn't have a contributor from Poland, and some of that is simply,
we tried.
yeah, we tried. Believe it or not, when you get a book contract, those of you who are in the contract class, they will tell you there is a word limit, and they actually mean it.
But I just cross out parts of contracts that I don't agree with.
So
Hot tip.
part of it is space. We do have a chapter on Europe, which looks at European law comparatively within, and
Right.
the author there, Neil Data, does spend a lot of time looking at anti-abortion and anti-gender movements and the progress they have made, and as well as how they use what's called the legal opportunity structure to do sort of a landscape analysis of where can they make headway and in what fora and with whom. So there's a regional human rights court system in Europe, and the highest court there is the European Court of Human Rights, how they can use maybe that to influence certain agendas, use the national courts, use different social, use different political tools that are at the disposal in various countries, like citizens referenda, create movements, use the media, and so on, just as the pro-choice or the women's health and rights movement used as well in all of these countries. So there is some discussion of of Poland in there. But yeah, the full criminal abortion ban countries, we didn't tell the story of Nicaragua, for example.
Yeah.
Which, there can always be a sequel, right?
Well, and then I would add that there is sequel. But no, and then Satang's chapter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who wrote about different reform moments across African countries and the passage of a protocol called the Mapatu Protocol that introduced for the first time in the region a right to reproductive health. And but that is a complicated story because she also regionally is thinking about moments of criminalization in Kenya that then inspired backlash. Part of the reason that we didn't focus entirely, we were really interested in a diversity of place and a diversity of perspective, but one goal was that it is hard to contest that the trajectory globally and comparatively has been, as we said, toward permission and away from criminalization. And we have spent a long time between us investigating why. And that's, I think, of interest to people who have views supportive of abortion and people who have views that are not supportive of abortion. Because, for instance, the human rights regime, international human rights law and international human rights bodies, in the last 20 years in particular, but with a little bit longer history, they have really embraced the mantra of reproductive rights or human rights. And that has legs. It does work for national reform moments, and it does work in legitimizing repeal of criminal laws and on creating a kind of club of countries that are progressive in the way they think about abortion. And that, I think, puts a lot of questions on the table. I myself have been critical of that strategy in a sense of what does progressive mean? What does universal mean? It's not very popular to be critical of human rights. But that was one of our aims, was to try to put some of those perspectives on the table in thinking about where there are divisions in that, where are there fissures in that foundation of a general move toward acceptance.
And just to elaborate on that and to answer your question about who the audience is as well, I come to abortion, reproductive rights through human rights. And for those of you who focus on Latin America or know a lot about Latin America, but also globally, the 1990s, early 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, became a time where there was lots of constitutional revision and reform. Colombia, for example, rewrote their constitution. It's very rights rich, lots of incorporation of international human rights into the Constitution. And to see, what did that enable? What does that constrain? How do advocates use the human rights regime nationally, which of course is where it's meant to have the most enforcement and impact? It was very interesting. We put that question to the authors. The chapter on Ireland engages with it a lot because Ireland made a huge amount it used the international human rights system to critique a lot of the existing legal regime and constitutional regime in Ireland. They used the European Court, but it hit a limit, and then it became a national process. It's a really interesting, I love that chapter. I recommend it highly. So the audience is really for people who are interested in history, interested in human rights, interested in obviously abortion, but also those who like to make strange the world in which they live in, tell stories about how things are and how they can be different. I often, like to think of comparativists as anthropologists, right? You're constantly looking at why is it this way? How does it make sense? What are the people doing that this works for them? And then implicitly, how does that explain my own universe to me. So I think, like, I think we're all comparativists, in our everyday lives. I hope we are. So it really speaks to anybody who's curious. We do have discounts. So if you're, 80% curious.
They give them out for people who get the right answer on the Remedies review tomorrow. The book can be yours. Something to strive for.
That's great. So I think we have I think we have an audience that's at least 90% curious, and we'll take a 30% discount.
Okay.
So we'll send that, maybe we can send that out with something, Cooper, to the people who came. So if we maybe get a little bit more into the chapters themselves. And I know that one issue that is kind of in the book as a whole is whether or not, I mean, part of it was, were other countries following the US in Roe? So then our country's going to follow the US in Dobbs. Or are they going to differentiate themselves, which of course is a question that countries are facing about many issues in relation to the US right now. And I know one of the pieces in the book, the chapter on India, actually talks about sort of how the debates are playing out along those lines in some ways. So I'd be curious to hear, I mean, I think folks we'd like to hear maybe a little bit more about, without losing our curiosity, the way that the US might be playing a role in either countries following or resisting perhaps what we've done. And maybe tell folks a little bit about that chapter, because I think
Yeah.
it'd be interesting.
So it's a chapter written by a professor, Deepika Jain, who's based in
Jindal,
yeah,
which is in Pune, I think.
Yeah. And she does a really nice job kind of looking at how the Supreme Court of India has selectively cited certain Supreme Court cases from the United States, and particularly in its abortion jurisprudence, to make the case for liberalization. And there's, I'm not sure that she, again, word limits, but suggests that the gulf between what the Supreme Court says and what actually happens is very big. And that and that, part of the role that citing US law is playing, at least at the level of Supreme Court decisions in India, is to join an international conversation, to take part in a conversation around liberalization of certain intimate identity, sexual rights. But it's with some discordant effects, because there are decisions in which the US has been cited affectionately, and then there are decisions in which the US is a warning. And Dobbs features as the latter, but it's one of the few places Dobbs has shown up. Now it's early days, it's only been a few years, so we might see more and more. But it's one of the only chapters in which the author can point to a more immediate impact that Dobbs had, and except in the European context, where there's been a lot of conversation around what does Dobbs mean for gender equality and for gender and conceptions of gender. But that's, I think, a really interesting piece of this, in part because, there's also a timing question. Some of the cases that revolved around same-sex relationships and abortion in India were going through the system as Dobbs was being decided. So there was a confluence there of, decisions being issued. So I think, TBD, but
yeah, I mean, in Neil Dada's chapter, which also is a comparative look at what is happening in Europe and what happened in Europe, he obviously points to France, which, you know, on the occasion of Dobbs, took it, even though access to abortion in France is still somewhat restricted and somewhat regulated in the criminal code, incorporated access to abortion in the Constitution. So to great fanfare, made the symbolic and emphatic embrace of a kind of anti-American posture, right? Of course, access to abortion in France is difficult because access to the health services themselves, where you can get abortion, is constrained. So, there is this disconnect between, again, a formal embrace, a rejection of Dobbs, and the actual lived experience. We haven't had a chapter length treatment of it, but it will be interesting. And I believe it's the 4th year anniversary of that constitutional amendment. So it'll be interesting to see, what gets written afterwards. I think at the heart of whether or not Dobbs has legs to do with how abortion is framed within national contexts, as well as sexuality. Is it a matter of equality, or is it a matter of sort of national identity and tradition? And secondly, is gender equality and embrace of diverse sexualities part of national identity or not? And I think that's how we'll see it play out. You certainly see it in the international human rights system at the moment, where there is pushback on the word gender itself, and the pushback is coming from countries that take a much more traditional approach to what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what the gendered expectations are for those roles. So it's a site of great dynamism, and it is actually putting a lot of pressure on an international system that, is facing pressure from so many different sides. But I do think it's a field of play for what will become national laws and policies around abortion and diverse sexuality and same-sex marriage and all of those issues.
And the epilogue gets to that a little bit in terms of the ways in which the countries are coming together under the Geneva Consensus Declaration. So,
No, the less said, the better.
okay. Well, okay.
No, I mean, if you want to, but I don't.
Well, actually, I want to open it up. So maybe I just ask, I think there's an important thread throughout the book and in looking at the different stories. So maybe I'll just end with this one for now, of what's happening in the countries, which was sort of the confluence of COVID and the accessibility of medication abortion. And some of that was because COVID made it more accessible, and that seemed to play a role in some of the stories. But just more generally, it seems that the accessibility or lack of accessibility has a huge impact on what's happening on the ground. And since you're emphasizing that so much, I wonder if you could say more about that.
Yeah, so thank you. I think that's right, because against the backdrop of legal change, these reform moments, of course, the nature of abortion care, at least early abortion care, has changed quite a lot. So in our own country, the majority of abortions now occur through medication abortion, which is a 2-drug regimen approved by the FDA before 10 weeks of pregnancy, but often prescribed through 13 weeks of pregnancy. Across the world, the first drug, mifepristone, is not typically taken. I shouldn't say typically, but in many places, it's the second drug, misoprostol, that's used to end a pregnancy. And pills travel. You can mail them. And we're at a point in our own country where there's lots of concerted thinking about how to stop mailed medication abortion, as there is concerted thinking about how to increase it. And so, there's that piece. And then there's the piece of self-managed abortion that we have Patty Skusker, who's at Penn, wrote a chapter on the kind of global uptake of self-managed abortion that medication abortion has facilitated. And that, I think, one of the things that the thread is how, law is both important and not important in interesting ways. So in the sense that people can self-manage, order pills online and take them in the privacy of their homes. Law need not be involved in the sense that you're not going to a clinician's office. You are maybe skirting the law or acting in the shadow of the law, or you're in a place that's using what it's called menstrual regulation. So you never take a pregnancy test and you order the pills from someone saying, I haven't had my period, I'm late, what should I do? And someone says, well, gee, why don't we make your period start? And you take abortion pills, but it's not an abortion under law. It's called menstrual regulation. And so then you're in kind of the shadow of the law. And then sometimes you're following the law. You're in the UK, which has allowed you to have male medication abortion for COVID-related reasons, which happened here in this country too, that before, okay, I'll just say one quick little thing. But in 2020, a federal district court here in Maryland issued a decision that lifted an FDA restriction on mifepristone, the first drug, that required people pick it up in person. And it was a COVID measure. It was to reduce patient-physician contact. And the UK was featured prominently in this decision as a jurisdiction that had done that. It was on the back of that the FDA first contested the decision and then didn't, and then suspended the rule and then lifted the rule, and now is being sued again to reimpose the rule. So lots happening. Everyone's suing the FDA. No one is happy with the FDA. But in the UK, the law is important. We were talking about this just for the panel. Now people are they are under the thumb of law for taking medication abortion in instances where law did not provide after COVID. And that is a continuing lesson that, well, you can act in the shadow of the law, you can act against law, you can act in compliance of law, but it is setting the parameters of what is possible in many ways. And that's a real challenge because it's setting parameters in a situation in which the gap between what law says it's doing and what people are doing to end pregnancies, that gap is also becoming very big. And so, it's a fascinating question to think about what is happening here in the United States. Vis-a-vis what has happened in other countries and is happening in places like the UK or truly elsewhere. Brazil has done this, has used medication abortion, misoprostol, for decades. And so this is, we're not in a new point in experience in this country vis-a-vis abortion pills.
And a number of the chapters raise for you law students an interesting question. The chapter on Brazil by Mariana, the chapter on Colombia by Isabella, and the chapter on Canada by Joanna raise the conundrum of when you turn to law to liberalize a practice, you're also inviting the state to limit the practice, right? Set the limits on it. You can do this, you're good. You cross that line, you've run afoul of the law, and you're actually subject to criminal sanctions. In the case of abortion, the criminal law is the regulatory background law, and there are made exceptions. So in Brazil, there is a movement, I would call them utopian feminists, but they are self-help activists who don't really want the law. They want to be able to, they have access to accurate information on self-managed abortion. They have access to the medication, and they should be free from the remit of the law. Similarly, in Colombia, which just expanded its abortion law quite quite liberally for, I don't know if it's certainly up, I believe it's up to 24 weeks. Previously, it had been 12 weeks. Folks who self-manage their abortions without getting involved in the health system, are they themselves subject to criminal law or not? It's kind of an unanswered question. At the point of writing, there hadn't been any prosecutions. And similarly, and in response to Dobbs, in Canada, a lot of the feminists wanted Canada, which does not have an abortion law per se, each province regulates access to abortion through its health system. They wanted a federal law protecting access to abortion. And there was an active discussion among feminists and others whether or not that would be a good thing or a bad thing. And like the jury is out. So I just leave that, you know, and thinking about how law works, you know, when does it enable, when does it constrain, who are the people targeted by it? And in the context, what are the background rules that this will play out of for those who no longer are within the charmed circle of legal protection?
Fabulous. Okay, you all don't deserve a 30% discount. I think we should increase it to 20%, 20% more, because it's such a fabulous book. Why don't we bring in some questions?
But abortion access on a spectrum. One side of the spectrum is the countries where abortion is more legislated. What are a couple countries that are in and where? Spectrum.
Great question. It's really hard to answer in the abstract. And it's even hard to answer about the United States per se, right? Because there's so much variation within the states. So the experience in Texas is very different from the experience in Massachusetts or the experience in California. The best place for a person who has the potential to become pregnant to control their own reproductive destiny, you know, it's much broader than just abortion. I mean, I'm always a fan of the Nordic countries. But I wonder if that's true. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Netherlands and Nordic, I mean, it's so because I think what Mindy's getting at, and thank you for the question, Olivia.
Yeah.
Is that, you know, the idea of, you know, and I like the spectrum question because it's both the legal permission to end a pregnancy without punishment, but it's also the healthcare system that enables people to be pregnant and have children, enables people to care for those children and enables those children to have healthy futures. And so that's a whole spectrum itself of supporting prenatal care, supporting postnatal care, but, you know, and so part of what I think you're nodding to is, you know, there's legal permission to end a pregnancy, but there's also support for all kinds of reproductive decisions throughout one's life. And, you know, on the opposite end of the spectrum, I think Nicaragua.
Yeah. El Salvador is pretty,
I mean, those would be criminal regimes where there's a threat of, we were talking about this also before, you know, there's a pretty strong international trend not to imprison the person having an abortion, but Nepal did that at one point in time, and there was extreme backlash, and it changed its laws. But, you know, it's a great question too, because the US itself is on that spectrum,
yeah.
as Mindy just said, where, you know, there's laws doing a lot of work in the sense of total bans with very narrow exceptions, you know, for only life, to states that have, you know, don't have restrictions that are time limited or exception based or the like. Although the trend in this country still is very much tied to viability. But, you know, so I think that's
And the other dimension of your question is like, who is seeking to terminate their pregnancy? It's very different if you have resources and what's your race, class, and other indicia, like obviously, right? So there's intersectional issues. So in El Salvador, where there has been criminalization of women who've terminated their pregnancies, it's indigenous women from rural and poor communities who, for whatever reason, wind up being subject to a criminal investigation where the abortion, which they may say was a miscarriage, wind up being prosecuted for murder and have been jailed, with sentences for 45 years. So it can be very carceral, very punitive, depending on who you are.
And very selective, yeah.
Yeah, very selective, and similar to what's happening in the United States as well,
And was happening in the United States before Dobbs,
of course.
which
Yeah.
we had a quote from Sissy Farenthold up there about that, which I think is because I realize that even these years, and we sort of forget, like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
not everyone had access even within the law.
There's a really great paper that I just read that it's a history, and it's making the case that when there's a comparison to where we are now being where we were before Roe, actually where we are now is a much more criminal-minded regime. Like that, before Roe, there was the acceptance, even, well before Roe, of reasonable medical judgment being based on good faith decision-making, exceptions that were always sounded in both health and life, kind of broader conceptions of what threats to health were in a pregnancy that are just not true now. Like those things are not true about how we assess reasonable medical judgment to make decisions around our exceptions met, or the kind of breadth of how exceptions are interpreted or applied, which is one reason we should all be comparativists, because exceptions matter.
But can I ask you this question? And I think the difference, though, is, and maybe it's coming back, but I definitely think there's less stigma around discussion of abortion, discussion of reproductive and sexual rights than there certainly were before Roe.
It'd be interesting to get a sense of students in Texas, whether that's their experience.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It'd be great to hear.
No
I mean,
pressure.
yeah, no. There's
I mean, it's good.
yeah.
Well, thank you
Maria.
very much, Rachel. I have a lot of questions and just like a lot of things I would like to discuss with you. But I'll start with this one. So I've had this question which obsesses me for the last couple of years, which is why in a similar time frame in the last couple of years we saw the expansion of abortion rights in nation. For example, in like countries in South America, and the restriction of abortion rights in the U.S. on Central America. And I don't know if maybe some chapters in this book like tell us why, or like give like some clues about why, like what is the role, for example, of courts, of social movements, like what's the reason behind apparently different trajectories in the same sentence or in a sentence.
It's a great question.
Our whole book is dedicated to that question.
We don't give that answer in the book, but I think if you read it, you could pull that out. And a big difference between the United States and South America has to do with feminist social movements. And, just the broad base for organizing, like in Argentina and in Colombia and Mexico, that the United States, perhaps because of Roe, stymied some of that kind of, cross-movement advocacy. And it became really like the Roe became sort of the property of elite litigators and not a social movement.
Yeah.
Or that's what I would say.
Well, I did a talk for the Federalist Society a few weeks ago, and Josh Blackman was here, who writes a lot about, hasn't written a ton about abortion, but has written a lot in terms of kind of, I would say pro-life values. And he was it was fascinating because he said what I think a lot of people think across the spectrum of thoughts about abortion, which is that the pro-life movement is in real disarray. Like, having achieved a decade's goal of overturning Roe, there's now a lot of fracture within the movement about what is the goal. Clearly, one goal would be to end abortion nationally. But, there's a lot of difference in thinking about how to get there and why. And so, to Mindy's point, what was a kind of cohesive, more disciplined movement toward chipping away at Roe is now a little bit more in free form, whereas the kind of rights-based, very constitution-minded reproductive rights movement is kind of pivoted to being much more movement-oriented, access-oriented, and medication abortion is a big part of that. And so, it's a fascinating question because you see this shift happening in real time as folks are recalibrating. I mean, it's really interesting that there's a lot of frustration from pro-life litigators that they are not getting more traction. Like, this is constantly in the news, and so it's fascinating.
But just to finish, friends in Latin America always tell me in South America is we are not the United States. Like, every country has its own history. It's all unique, and the US is really vexing.
Rachel, you had mentioned viability, and I was wondering actually if, I guess, I've been seeing, a lot of the rights framework in the U.S. has been tagged on viability. Elsewhere, it seems to be more broadly autonomous. And I wonder if the viability context, the extent that that U.S. doctrine was being looked at, was ever commented abroad. And then second, with that bond, whether you see any states going the other way and pulling from the international economy focus happening states or still stuck conversation.
Fascinating question. I think there are some states that don't have abandoned their viability lines in the United States as a reaction to Dobbs, but a lot have kept them. And it's not with criminal punishment, but I mean, there are some with criminal punishment for abortion that is after viability and not for an exception. But some have relaxed that from being less criminal to whatnot. What I think is fascinating is, to kind of contradict what I just said about movement in the United States, and then I'll answer taking the viability, and I'd love to know what you think. What I think is fascinating is that there are states that have been very vocal about supporting abortion rights, being pro-reproductive rights states, but still have kept on the books all kinds of restrictions. And parental involvement is a great example. Lots and lots of states have parental involvement laws that require notice or consent to a parent or a minor to get an abortion. And it's striking, there's not a move, or that's not true. There's probably lots of people talking about this, but there's not like a wave of states that are, I think, denouncing parental involvement or the like. And viability has been, to use your word, vexing, as an international matter because the trimester system of Roe was adopted by a number of countries and legislation passed after, in the 70s and 80s up through the 90s. And then there were, attempts to relax the kind of trimester approach to regulation. But viability has hung on. It has hung on as the idea at which law needs to intervene, the point at which law should intervene. And that is something that I think has been what's tough for a conversation. I'm trying to think of like a rejection of viability by a country as
Yeah.
a kind of anti-model, because it's a great question. Like South Africa is what I mentioned earlier. It tracks very clearly a trimester framework. Now it provides broad exceptions late in pregnancy, but there's still exceptions. And it was an idea. It was 1994, and it was a reaction to Casey and the erasure of the trimester system and the adoption of an undue burden standard. So,
I mean, I really haven't, it's a great question. And I come from it more from the perspective of having worked on some guidance for the World Health Organization. And globally, I think health has been the predominant framework for liberalization of abortion laws. There's on the one hand, a movement to promote medication abortion, which is for early abortion. And even though there's, a lot of, is it 9 weeks? Is it 13 weeks? It still kind of tracks the first trimester. There are then a big exception for health and life and how do you define health? And that almost goes to, quite far out. And it then becomes the purview of abortion providers, doctors, some advanced health professionals in certain countries, and maternal fetal health specialists. So it becomes a technical conversation about the practice of medicine. And there, WHO wants a well-regulated environment, but certainly, access and support and training and all of that. So it just, it's not viability as much as the health of the pregnant person that predominates the conversation. And there's not a focus on the fetus. But that's, when you look at national laws, the fetus comes in, and the fetus comes in as, an indication if, fetal development is incompatible with life, right? That's a ground for abortion. So it kind of viability is always there, but I do think health is overtaking it. And I also think the discussion around self-managed abortion and access to medication abortion is almost cleaving the discussion of like what abortion means into like two different conversations.
yeah.
So we are at time. Do you want to each take a minute to say a response to a question I didn't ask? No, is it, do you want to have a takeaway moment?
Well, this is what I would say. Thank you so much for coming and listening us to talk about abortion. I often like come into a room and I'm like, yes, I'm the abortion lady, abortion. But I never think abortion is about abortion. I mean, for me, abortion is really about participation in our own lives and having some ability to control the direction of our lives, recognizing we live in a complicated society. So for those of you who can become pregnant, abortion is something to think about. And for those of you who might be involved in a pregnancy, I think it affects all of us, but it really is, I think, about being participants in our own lives.
Yeah, I'm going to get you a plaque that says abortion lady. put on your desk. I also want to say thank you. It's been a joy to work with Mindy.
Likewise, to work with me, but to work with.
Yeah, I've also enjoyed working with myself. And it's really thank you to Cooper, thank
Yeah,
you to
thank you.
Blake, thank you to
And
Karen. Thank you to, did I see Brianna somewhere? There you are. Thank you to Neville, who's the co-director in the back there. Thank you all for coming.
Maya.
Where's Maya? Oh, Maya. I
As long
swear
as
you
we're
weren't
gonna do it,
here.
we can't miss
Yeah,
anybody.
I know. Well, I swear I didn't see Maya, so that's why I didn't say her name, but I had seen Brianna at some point.
Well, thank you all very, very much. I know we've just scratched the surface, so that's why everybody has to get the book. Have I mentioned that? And it's really quite an accomplishment. Congratulations. And we're going to have you back as soon as volume 2 is out.
Okay.
Okay, tell us which countries you'd like to see.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you.